So we can hop right in. Welcome to today's webinar. As you can see in the chat, we're going to introduce ourselves too, but take a second to introduce yourself to the folks that are on our call as well. So I am your host, Carly Norton. I'm the Director of Marketing at KickUp, which is a company that provides software to school districts to collect and use data on PD and instructional practice so that ultimately we can improve instructional outcomes. Like many of you on the call, we've seen how much COVID has upended this school year. For a lot of school districts, it's never been more important to focus on building educator capacity, but the very real logistics like device access, lunch distribution, and many parent communication also demand this attention that makes focusing on improving the quality of instruction or really any improvement effort feel really daunting. So the thing is that continuous improvement was actually made for those exact types of environments. It provides a method for experimentation that can ultimately take us towards these small but frequent steps towards improvement. So today we wanted to host this conversation really to connect that research with practice and take a realistic approach to what continuous improvement can look like in your district. So specifically today, we're going to talk first about some continuous improvement principles that work across different teaching environments. Then we're going to jump into some real stories about districts and how they're using these principles. And lastly, we're going to dig into some feedback loops and data collection methods that we hope you can steal and use in your own school districts or organizations. In terms of time, we're going to spend that first chunk laying the groundwork about continuous improvement, but we're really going to spend the bulk of our time today in these two examples, including hearing about how Anaheim Union High School District is improving EL engagement and how districts are using data collection to monitor online instruction. And then lastly, as always, we'll aim to leave a little bit of time for some questions and wrapping up and send you away with some goodies. So with that housekeeping out of the way, I want to acknowledge my two guests here today and give them a chance to introduce themselves as well, starting with David Brazer from TeachFX. David, maybe you could tell us just a little bit about yourself and TeachFX.
Thank you, Carly, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'm really privileged to have this opportunity to speak with you about continuous improvement. A little bit about me is that I started out my professional life as a middle school and high school teacher in the Detroit metropolitan area. I was interested in running schools after having experienced the classroom for a few years and worked on my PhD at Stanford and then went into high school administration, serving on the San Francisco Peninsula as an assistant principal and later as a principal. I also had the ambition to be a university professor and so took that option after a while and spent a good 20 years on preparing educational leaders and conducting research. A lot of my research is related to today's topic of continuous improvement, and the practical results of that research are included in a book called Using Research to Lead School Improvement. And my friend and colleague, Zach Crego, will put into the chat at some point a PDF of some excerpts that you might be interested in if you want to go deeper after today. Thank you.
Thanks, David. And also I'm joined today by Manuel Colon, who is the Chief Academic Officer at Anaheim Union High School District. Manuel, maybe you could tell us just a little bit about what you do at AUHSD, which is a lot of letters, and I'm sure you can say it a lot faster than I can.
Not quite, but good morning, everyone. I'm in California, so I have to say good morning to everyone. We're super excited to be here and to be a part of this conversation. As was mentioned, my name is Manuel Colon, and I'm the Chief Academic Officer with the Anaheim Union High School District in Southern California. We're right next to Disneyland, so it's right a stone throw away. But just very quickly, in terms of my background, this is almost my 30th year in education. I've been a teacher, I've been a junior high principal, a senior high principal, assistant superintendent, and I'm now currently the Chief Academic Officer. And again, super excited to be here.
Thanks, Manuel. So I want to turn it over first. As I promised, we're going to start with talking about continuous improvement principles. just to kind of ground ourselves a little bit in the research before we jump into our examples. So I'm going to turn it over to David. Oops. Yeah, we'll skip over this. We already did that in the chat. So I'm going to turn it over to David just to kind of get us started on what continuous improvement is and some of the key learnings that he's found so far.
Thanks again. You know, continuous improvement is a term that most people love in theory, but they fear it in practice because we tend to fear and resist change. Adhering to this first principle, positive change is the goal, requires recognizing that the status quo is inadequate. Improving instructional practices, for example, may be difficult in the short term because of fear and resistance, but perseverance leads to long-term improved learning. Next slide, please. Everyone can agree that positive change is a good idea, as long as you don't change what I'm doing or my favorite program. Changing the status quo means no aspect of the status quo can be protected from scrutiny, however. To say that we are going to close achievement gaps without examining institutional bias, for example, bakes failure into the effort of continuous improvement. No sacred cows. The third principle, data informs choice, brings objectivity to the process and helps to resist the emotional inertia of the status quo. Data, both quantitative and qualitative, help us to understand what needs to be changed and why it needs to be changed if a system is to improve. We can neither preserve a traditional curriculum nor adopt a new one based on a hunch. We need data to help us understand the what, the why, and the how of a current curriculum and anything we might adopt in the future. So those are the three simple principles I like to keep in mind whenever working on continuous improvement. Positive change is our goal. You can't have sacred cows, and data informs choice. Now at this point, if we could have the next slide, we want to understand a little bit about your experience with continuous improvement. So we've created a quick poll that we'd like to launch right now and have you respond, and then we'll have a little discussion after the poll. Not sure, do you want me to launch that poll? I can do that, maybe.
So it looks, I believe it is launching. We're getting some feedback in here. It looks like right now the highest response is some positive, some negative. So people like a little bit of it, everything, but also seeing people responding, we've tried some new things, but I'm not sure if they were effective. As well as developing a great plan, but the implementation was incomplete. So it sounds across the board like people are kind of dipping their toes in. They've started some things, but haven't felt confident that it's resulted in change yet.
Well, as those results are coming in, I would love to hear from some of you about what you think worked really well, even if it's only a piece of the process, and where you found some perhaps roadblocks or stumbling blocks. You can chat your responses, or we'd love to hear from you directly. Here's my favorite. We had a lot of meetings, but nothing really came out of them. Anybody want to share? What is that like? Well, we're a little reticent on the big webinar, and I understand that. It is helpful to hear from you. Well, Luke from KickUp puts an interesting comment in the chat. That some of you said implementation was where the plan broke down. What got in the way? I can tell you a lot of what I've experienced from a number of continuous improvement projects is that the upfront work gets done, but then there's a new reform of the day or the month that comes along and sweeps away all of the previous work because someone in the school district or the school has decided we need to change direction. That's one of the big problems in actually moving from the beginning stages all the way through implementation. We have another comment that says teachers are using technology tools with students in ways they never had, which sounds like a continuous improvement process that worked really well. People got some support. Brett comments, everyone wants to see change, but is everyone truly committed? Data can be overwhelming and somewhat cumbersome. Brett, that is a fantastic point. Even though we know we want to be data informed, it's very hard to understand a lot of times what data is telling us. And that's why one of the important roles of a school leader is to organize data for everyone else so that it can be understood. It takes time and a lot of careful thought, but it's a process well worth engaging in.
Yeah, and one just quick tactical note, we're seeing some comments come in, but make sure that you have your comments set to send to all panelists and attendees. And so we can see the comments as a panelist, but we want to make sure that you guys can see and respond as well in the chat.
And I want to thank you for your comments. I'm going to respond to one more. From Lisa. She says all students in a school without having everyone being truly committed. Are you hearing me okay? Because I just got that internet is unstable message.
You're back,
Okay.
David.
All right, so I'll go on. My belief is that one way to build commitment is to involve a large number of people, or everyone if you can, in your school in the initial problem analysis, which we're going to get into in just a moment. Because one of the ways in which change breaks down is that everyone has a different definition of the problem we're working on in their head. And so they tend to go in different directions or feel as though the direction is wrong. So getting aligned from the very beginning on what is the problem we're trying to solve is really critical. Let's go to the next slide. Continuous improvement begins with what we call gap analysis, a careful examination of the difference between what we set as instructional goals and the instructional outcomes that we experience. These data answer the question, what happened for students in our school? Gap analysis requires that we inquire into the shortcomings of the status quo. My depicting the gap description as a cloud is intentional. It's not easy to describe what happened in schools because schools are complex and they live in a lot of ambiguity. That's the nature of education. Here we see goals and outcomes from a hypothetical school. My hypothetical examples are intended to be illustrative and, in the interest of time, are kind of simplistic. Many school districts adopt the on target by third grade goal. Equally common is an outcome such as I've placed here. 45% of students are not meeting that everyone on grade level by third grade goal. Now we need to describe that outcome in more detail to assist the gap analysis. Next slide. Teacher-made and standardized tests indicate that students are experiencing different levels of success in meeting the on-grade level goal. And these differences show a pattern related to students' learning needs. Notice I added a hypothetical comment from teachers. This is intended to signal to you that qualitative data also informs our understanding. Something unintended in the school's inclusion structure may be important to understand students with disabilities' performance. With a satisfactory description of a performance gap in hand, we want to know why that performance gap exists and persists. Figuring out this why involves root cause analysis, also informed by data that helps us to understand. Next slide. Making positive change requires addressing the root causes of a performance gap rather than the gap itself. If we can make the reasons for the gap go away, then the gap itself will be reduced or will disappear. This may seem obvious in a webinar, but in practice, because of time constraints and other problems, continuous improvement efforts often jump from gap to action. And that's a shortcut that is susceptible to missing the causes and creating disappointment after implementation. To illustrate what I mean by action steps addressing root causes, My graphic has an action for each cause listed. Real life is, of course, more complicated. As part of action planning, we would need to identify additional resources necessary to take the actions listed. For example, special education paperwork may need to be handled by someone other than the special education teacher, so she can maximize her time in classrooms with students. That staff time needs to be provided somehow, that staff time to support the special education teacher. Another critical factor not displayed is the need to evaluate the effectiveness of actions. We need to collect implementation process and outcomes data. I've built in oral participation as a means of improving student learning because that is where I focus in my work at TeachFX. Apps like TeachFX that measure teacher talk and student talk can demonstrate the frequency and extent of students' learning through talk. Now, we've partnered with the Anaheim Union High School District to help teachers elevate student voice for deeper learning. Manuel will show you how that's working with their real-world example.
Perfect. Thanks, David. Manuel, I'll turn it over to you. Let's hear about what's going on in Anaheim.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Tell you a little bit about our district, just to give you the context. So the Anaheim Union High School District is in Southern California. As I shared before, we're a 7th through 12th grade district, secondary district. We have approximately 30,000 students in our district, 20 schools, and we serve 5 cities in this area. We also have 5 elementary schools, so you can imagine how challenging that could be in terms of our articulation, but we do have some great feeder elementary schools. In terms of our demographics, we have 70% of our students are economically disadvantaged or fear reduced lunch. 20% of our students are English learners, and 14% of our students are students with disability. In terms of our demographics, about 68% of our students are Latinx, 13% Asian, 9% white, and about 2% African American. We also have a tremendous amount of languages, which we're really proud of, represented in our demographics, getting close to 30. So we're super excited about that. In terms of our district, I think it's important for us to start with the foundation. Our focus, and I would assume you would agree in terms of our kids and what we're currently dealing with the pandemic, has been on what we call the 5 C's, which are collaboration, communication, creativity, critical thinking, and character and compassion. These are those skills that we believe our students need as a foundation for success in college, career, and life. We believe that if our students have these skills, they will be tremendously successful, both navigating the current world as well as the future world. For us, this is what we do. This is our culture in our district. We also have a very strong civic engagement initiative within our district. We are part of the California Democracy Schools. Many of our schools have already become California Democracy Schools, which really, for those of you that are from California, we encourage you to do that. But it really encompasses how do we engage our entire school population in civic engagement and civic action. Again, all of that related to our 5 C's. And our students, as we go through our system, we really are very intentional about how do we compile the work that our kids are doing around these 5 C's. And with that, we encourage our students in our schools to implement a capstone-like project, which many of our schools do. Again, in trying to really help our students understand how they're going to navigate not only the current reality, but also their future goals. But as we have been successful in our district, tremendously successful, we also know and are aware of the gaps. As Dr. Bracer said, for us, the need gap analysis of where we are was really an eye-opener. We know that many of our students are being successful. We know that we are ensuring that our students continue to grow as learners, but we know that once we see the data, we know that there are some gaps. And so this just gives you a snapshot of the reality that we had been facing in terms of our English learners. This is true across California, especially California. I know that it's across the United States, but our English learners, along with our students with disability, are the students that struggle the most. And considering where we are with virtual learning, we see that now in virtual learning, our English learners are the ones that are also struggling the most. But this has been our challenge. And so for us, it was about, what do we do? What actions are we going to need to take? What does the data show? And how can we improve this? It's a non-negotiable for us. We have to improve EL achievement. We've seen the achievement consistently, or the underachievement consistently, for many, many years. So for us, we needed to take a pause. We needed to say, this is not good, and we need to take a different direction. So for us, this data has been consistent, but we are at a point where we need to take a different direction. So for us, this was important as we move forward with the data that we needed to address. Next slide. So we formed about 5 years ago a EL task force, and really it was about taking a deeper dive into the data. We looked at quantitative and qualitative data to see what was happening with our English learners. As I said before, this had been an ongoing issue. The data had not changed for many, many years. And so for us, we needed to put a pause and really start to go deeper with what was happening with our English learners in particular. Our school-wide data was obviously improving because of the initiatives that we had put in place, yet our English learner data was pretty flat. So we started with looking at the research. What research was out there in regards to English learners? We unpacked just about every research you can imagine. We brought in EL experts from California. We've done a lot of work in California with English learners. And so for us, we had a lot of expertise that we can tap into. We also did shadow learning walks. And for those of you that have not done shadow walks, we extremely encourage you to do that, because that was really the eye opener for many of our teachers in terms of understanding the learning for English learners and the changes and the shifts that we needed to make to improve EL achievement. We also looked at a lot of data. As I shared with you before, we looked at all kinds of achievement data, college going data, everything that we can get our hands on, including unpacking transcripts. We looked at every single graduating senior in our district from last or the previous year, and really unpacked a story about what was happening with our English learners, why they weren't completing or graduating as the rest of our students, or achieving college going rates as the rest of our district. So all of these things were things that we needed to address as we were looking at the root cause of our situation with our students, with our English learners. So what we found, we developed recommendations, which really became the roadmap for our schools. These actions were very clear in terms of what we needed to do as a district. We developed and created systems at each of our sites to constantly analyze the data. It goes back to that continuous improvement model. And what we found that the key finding was that student engagement was important. Student engagement was critical. And from the research from Rachel Lotan was that participation, the more participation, the more the students will learn. That was a key fact in terms of what we were doing and the actions that we were going to take as a district. So it was important and it was critical that that we start there. And what you see with the next slide is that, and what we found was that about 80% of the teachers are doing most of the talk. In our district, what we found, it was more like 90% of the talk was being done by our teachers. We thought that that was not acceptable. The moment we started to engage and the moment we started to do professional learning on student talk, things started to change. There was an awareness by our teachers. There was an awareness in terms of the strategies they were using. There was an awareness in terms of how they were supporting English learners. And as I shared with you with the shadow walks, and in the next slide, you're gonna see the shadow walks really, the previous slide, please. The shadow walks really were the eye openers where we saw that that learning and that engagement was just non-existent with our students. So this became the foundation for our professional learning. Another eye-opener was our 5 C's. As I mentioned, it was a foundation of everything that we are doing in our district. Our question was, how are the 5 C's aligning to the achievement of our English learners? It was obvious from our shadow walks that that was not happening. And so for us, it was critical that we made that shift and created a reflection for our teachers to really understand their instructional pedagogy. Again, the data that we saw with the qualitative and quantitative really helped us to see that this come to light pretty clearly. But it was critical. The reflection that our teachers were having as they were engaging in this process was critical in terms of the change and the shift that they were needing to make. With that, we used TeachFX, as was already shared, because we had no way of measuring student talk versus teacher talk. We knew what the research said. We knew what our data said. We knew our findings in terms of what we had in terms of unpacking our own data, but we had no way of really calculating and measuring that teacher versus student talk. So for us, this was critical. It was critical in that reflection. It was critical in terms of how our teachers were going to act in terms of that feedback. This became the foundation of PLC conversations. And as we now have conversations with our teachers, it's very clear that that teacher talk versus student talk is a common conversation in our schools. Again, it's also showing that just by this simple thing that we did, EL achievement across our district has grown tremendously. And I'll show you in a little bit what that result has been. We also were very targeted about the professional learning. We knew what was going on. We looked at the data. We knew what we needed to do in terms of taking action. And in addition to the PLC conversation and the implementation of TeachFX, we also were very targeted in terms of the types of professional learning that we were doing, both in terms of our school leadership teams, our principals, as well as our teacher leadership teams in terms of their PLCs. And also, again, it went back to that constant feedback that we were receiving, both in terms of our conversations, but in terms of the data that we were seeing. That really created the change. So from this graph, you'll see the growth. And as I said at the beginning, we started with, our teachers having the majority of the conversation. It was amazing. The moment the teachers saw the data of themselves, when you ask them what percentage of the class do you think you talk? They are thinking they're talking about 70% of the time. When they see it in black and white that they're speaking 90, 95, 98% of the time, it's very eye-opening to them. And they stop and pause constantly about what they're doing and how they're asking questions, how they're engaging the students to get them to talk. The step that we took above that is, are you engaging your students with disability? Are you engaging your English learners in particular who need to have oral language practice? So as you can see from this graph, we've made tremendous gains. We're not there, and we're still working on it, but just that knowledge of knowing that student talk is critical for the learning for English learners has made a tremendous difference for our schools. And we're going to share with you a video of a teacher and her reflection utilizing the data that she received from TeachFX.
I think the sound isn't working. Marisol, can you try sharing one more time? And while she's doing that, Manuel, one question that I have for you, I think something that's come out of the chat as well is just the importance of really getting buy-in from all the stakeholders involved in a continuous improvement effort. And so one of the things that I think the video speaks to, and you've spoken to a little bit as well, is the buy-in that you have from your teachers of EL students. I can imagine that it's a little bit scary as a teacher to agree to be recorded and to and to get that feedback. So I'm curious, how did you kind of set the stage within the district that we're going to start collecting this data, and it's really to help us get better and not used in a scary way?
I think we started with the reality that we needed to do something different. I think our teachers understood we had to pivot in a different direction. Just knowing that helped them to say, let me try whatever we can to make a difference for our English learners. That was the first step. The second step is having it be something that was voluntary. Our teachers had to see it for themselves first, in terms of seeing the benefit that they were receiving from getting that feedback from the tool.
Yeah, that's great.
So the TeachFX app has supported my professional growth because it's allowed me not only to make sure that my students are on task during class time, but it's also helped me understand how to get them to practice the academic language that I'm trying to get them to use in the biology classroom. So what I like most about the TeachFX app is the recording of student conversations and then getting the data the next day of what my students were actually talking about. And I can read through it pretty quickly just to scroll through, what individual conversations were. So I can see very easily which students or what student groups were using academic language and which ones were not. So what was surprising to me is that I found that a lot of my EL students, even though they were on task, a lot of them were using procedural language as opposed to understanding the academic language and the conceptual understanding that I wanted them to have. A few weeks ago, I had my students making DNA models, so the C always had to match up with the G, so the orange and the blue card should have always gone together based on the code that I gave them, and then they had to come up with the amino acids, which are the yellow cards here. And so my EL students, what I realized, their conversations would be about where does the tape go? Do we put the red and the blue together, or do we put the red and the orange together? So a lot of my students were not using the academic language of adenine and thymine, or the DNA backbone, or hydrogen bonds. So that really helped my understanding as a teacher of what I needed to do to structure their conversation. So I was actually forcing them to use the academic language.
As you can see from Sabina's testimonial, this is gold for any administrator. To have a teacher be that reflective. Most of us don't know what's going on in the classroom. I mean, yes, we do. We are engaging. We are implementing our lesson. But to see what she was able to see through this tool really is making a huge difference in terms of the instruction for English learners. And this graph just goes to show you the data in our district and how we've shifted. If you look at the left side, this was before we started the English Learner Task Force. The yellows are where we were above most of our, we're compared to all the districts in Orange County. So you see all the districts listed in our area. And the yellows is where we were above or the same as the districts in our area. When you go to the right, this was the data just from last year. You see the contrast in terms of the yellow. You obviously see a lot more yellow. This is the growth that we've had. And so now you see that not only have we met, but we've exceeded many of the districts in our area when it comes to college going rates. And like anything else, it's about the grades. The learning is within the grades, and the college going rates really is reflective of what's happening in the classroom. So we're super excited about our growth. We're excited about the work that we've been doing. And again, we know that it's making a difference. And just finally, as we have gone into this pandemic, for us, because our foundation in terms of our professional learning, in terms of our 5 C's and what we've done with our schools and our staff, we have been very, we transitioned to the virtual learning pretty, we know it's been a challenge, but it's actually been pretty good in regards to all of the activities that we've done and we've been accustomed to doing without virtual. We've shifted them over to virtual. So we've done Parent Leadership Academy, shifted them to virtual, our virtual learning walks, and our virtual professional learning. We have not missed a beat. And this again goes to and is a testament to the leadership of our principals at the site level, our teacher leadership that we've built across our district. So again, thank you for this opportunity to share our work in the Anaheim Union High School District, and we continue to learn and improve every single day.
Thanks, Manuel. And Manuel's not going anywhere. If you have questions for him, we do have some time saved at the end of today as well. So feel free to pop them into the chat or use the Q&A button at the bottom. But our last example that we kind of want to present before we open it up to chat is really zooming in on improving online instruction. And so I want to start, as we usually do, with just a little bit of research that we use at KickUp. So at KickUp, one of the core tenets of our product and our approach is really based on Joel and Killian's theory about black box versus glass box evaluation. And if you're not familiar with Joel and Killian, first of all, you should absolutely get her book, Assessing Impact. It's so helpful. But one of the really core tenets here around glass box evaluation is this argument that a lot of times when we approach evaluating a professional learning intervention, we look at, we know that data is important, and we look at the outcome data, typically around student achievement, and we use that to figure out whether or not our inputs really had any effect. And so in thinking about sort of this like causal analysis that we want to do with continuous improvement, really her argument is that we have to pay attention to what's happening in the middle. And so we have to actually look at what are the interventions designed to do and collect that formative data along the way to see whether that intervention is actually accomplishing what we've hypothesized it would do. So you can see here on this chart that she has kind of looking at what's inside the box, as she would put it. And so when we collect data, a lot of times we throw out data, and data has become this big word with a capital D that often means student test scores. But really there are so many different types of data. And so when we talk about data specifically for continuous improvement, one of the pieces that the Carnegie Foundation puts out there, which is a great resource for continuous improvement as well, is this idea that there are different types of data. And so when we're talking about improvement work, we're really interested in practical measures. And so some of the other things that you might see come up are accountability measures, which are typically like outcome focused. So these are looking at standardized testing data, dropout rates, graduation rates, all of the things that are really, really important, but tend to give us more of the overarching success. And so they speak to, they have a lot of limitations when you're trying to move quickly around timeliness, or they speak to really the results of complex systems. When in improvement work, we're trying to get down to the nitty gritty of what we've done and whether or not it had the impact that we intended for it to have. So when we talk about these practical measures, and we can go to the next slide. Typically when we're talking about instruction, what we're looking at KickUp with our school districts is either, is kind of in two buckets. One is sort of looking at the activities that you do, so the professional learning supports you use to really implement a new initiative, to grow your teachers, to roll out the new changes you're trying to make in your district. And the other piece is capturing the results of those activities. So looking at instruction as it's happening. So put a different way, and I know I've committed the cardinal sin of slides here, so please forgive me and accept that I promise you'll get a copy of these slides. There's a lot of text on here, but these are just some of the data collection instruments that we use that are more of this like practical measure level. Things like surveys, walkthroughs, support logs, PD feedback. And I know I wish this was a classroom so I could just say like, raise your hand if I've introduced something you've never heard of. But I will accept, from speaking into my little Zoom window here, that most of you have probably used some of these data sources already. These are not, a new and innovative thing, but rather what's really striking about continuous improvement is that we make sure all of these tools are aligned in order to really sense whether or not the specific improvements we're trying to make are having the outcomes that we've predicted they'll have. And so we use things like surveys, equity audits, walkthroughs, which can look a lot of different ways. They can be teachers observing other teachers. They can be doing observations where you're just looking at student actions. And it can be as small as even just tracking, coaching activity that may be happening within your district, and mapping that back to what specifically are the topics of that coaching activity. So you can see, if we're really focused, like in Anaheim, focused on supporting our EL students, our coaches also spending their time supporting EL students. So we take all of these pieces of data and we put them back into like a continuous improvement cycle. And so here you can see how that might work. So you start by sort of setting goals, and that comes from doing a needs assessment, which can be very lightweight. It doesn't have to be that long, comprehensive survey you send at the beginning of the year. You can bite-size this and send them out every couple of months, so that they're a little bit smaller and easy to chunk. Then we plan those interventions that are aligned specifically to what educators have said are their needs, or what you've seen in walkthroughs are the needs within your educators. We provide that PD, and then we follow that up by implementing supports, coaching, mentors, additional PD opportunities. And along the way, we're monitoring progress and impact. So if we said, we've done all this supporting and we want to see instructional practice actually change, we can do something like a classroom walkthrough or a virtual walkthrough to see if those if they're actually being implemented with fidelity. And then last, which is something that we talked about just a little bit on this call earlier, is the importance of communicating those results. So we have to kind of bring everybody back into the cycle who was involved in the beginning to talk about what were the results of the intervention that we did. And then it starts all over because we never fixed it in the first round. And so that's why that arrow just continues as like one of those kind of continuous loading arrows that we get sometimes on our computer. So all that to say, I want to bring in one example from to make it real and kind of illustrate this continuous improvement cycle from one of our district partners in Texas. And so what happened with this district, as I'm sure many of you experienced over the summer, we saw this huge influx of requests for professional learning. I think everyone was learning something new over the summer or late spring. And that meant that there was just this increased appetite for professional learning. And so this district spent a lot of time really investing in their summer conference and investing in their professional learning to support their educators in implementing online instruction in a effective way. And so they did a couple of data collections to assess the impact of that professional learning. One piece started with collecting PD feedback. So if you're familiar with Guskey's levels of evaluation, they wanted to first get participant reactions. So we've just had the PD. How equipped do you feel to implement these? How was the experience? Those kind of beginning questions we ask. And what they found was that all of the feedback was really great, which I'm sure felt really great for their PD team and was a good initial indicator that teachers felt like it had been effective. But then the next step really was to understand whether or not they were prepared to implement their learning. And so what this district designed was a student-ready lesson project. And so they asked their educators to create, to move beyond a lesson plan, but to actually create a lesson that was ready to use within their classroom. And then they, as an instructional leadership, went in and took that lesson to assess whether or not they'd been able to apply the learnings from their professional learning. And what they found was that there was a little bit of a gap there, that many of their educators were ready to have like this really great lesson plan, but hadn't quite translated that into how they were going to use the tools and what it was practically going to look like. And so they went back and that gave them the very specific insight they needed to be able to say, these are the follow-up supports that we're going to provide through our coaching and through our additional professional learning supports. And so the last piece of this, last piece, as though we're ever really done, but the last piece of this specific, kind of assessing their PD was really launching walkthroughs. And so they do these within both their remote and in-person classes. And we can actually go to the next slide where we can see what that looks like. But the walkthroughs are really to assess, now that we've done this practice and you've done this project to kind of demonstrate your learnings, are you actually implementing them in the classroom? Because we know all of these pieces have potential gaps where we can lose educators. And so what they did, they started tracking their walkthroughs. And one of the key ways that they're tracking the results of their walkthroughs to this rubric is looking at on-campus versus remote, and then also looking at the subject breakdown. And what's really great about that is when we see the results, which I pulled out just a quick screenshot of some of these results to give you a sense. And I know it's a little bit small. Again, I promise these slides will be in your inbox soon. But what's neat about this is that we can actually drill in and look at the attributes in order to find the difference within our results that are meaningful, right? We have to find those differences to know how to adapt our interventions. And so in this case, what you're looking at here are their results broken out by subjects, math versus ELA, as well as on-campus versus remote. And so really to bring this back to our goal today of continuous improvement and what does it look like to really do this in practice, it's both having these lightweight measures and also designing those measures so that you get the kind of data that can be actionable. In this instance, a key thing that they did that we work with our districts to do is really figure out what attributes do you want to collect and align your data back to. And the key there is to think about what decisions would you use the data to make. And so in this case, we're looking at what trends might emerge in different subgroups. So grouping by subjects, grouping by types of instructions. And the second piece that I think a lot of people forget sometimes is like, what access do you want to give to people? And so thinking about that data, do we want to sort this out so that we can make sure our principals can log in and see it, that our board members can see this data? Thinking about that from the onset allows you to make sure that this data doesn't end up just in a report, but it actually becomes something that can power those continuous improvement cycles. So just want to wrap it up by saying, this data is really useful for making those tweaks as you go. But again, just to bring it back to this glass box evaluation principle, that data is also essential to making that connection between the interventions that you are putting into place and your ultimate outcomes. So of course, we're still using that student data, but by gathering these practical measures in between, we're able to build the case that our PD and our professional growth plan is actually contributing to the outcome we want in student achievement. Perfect. So with that, I want to open it up, the discussion just a little bit into the chat. And I want to ask, what types of data are you already using for your improvement work? We've talked through a couple examples on the call between measuring student and educator talk time with TeachFX, or any of these kind of surveys, walkthroughs, coaching logs, things that we also would load into KickUp. I'm curious, what are you using in your districts or with your organizations when you're trying to improve? And while I let a couple people work up the nerve to pop into the chat, if you're maybe in a couple other tabs, I want to ask Manuel, like, how does this data that you're using about student and educator talk time, how does that plug in with the other data that you're using at the district? And who do you share it with? I know I saw something in the chat box about the fact that the specific, individual teacher recordings are only shared with the teachers. But how are you kind of taking that data like up into the district to report on your progress?
It's absolutely right. The data that the teachers are gaining is their data. So we are, and that was very critical for us in terms of the implementation of TeachFX. But in terms of the district, we are looking at our both our learning walks to see how much of teacher talk is happening. So it's connected to our learning walks, both in terms of our teacher learning walks as well as our walkthroughs.
Got it. That's great. And I see some responses here. Thanks, Lisa. I see formative, state and local summative. And I think one of the big pieces that we see is just this need for both formative and summative data that a lot of times, again, like that's kind of another way of looking at the practical measures versus accountability or research, is that we're looking for those mechanisms we can see along the way to find progress. Perfect. Okay, well, I am gonna move us maybe to this last slide. Go forward one more for me. And as promised, I know we're getting close to the end of the hour, so I want to make sure that we can share some of our resources that we want to leave you with as well today. So first, we have a free guide to virtual walkthroughs. So if you've been watching this and you're still thinking, you know, this sounds great, but I don't know where to start, and I have a lot of emails to get to. I hear you. And one of the things that we've put out there is a guide to virtual walkthroughs. This has some indicators that you can pull from. You can plug into your own, you know, peer teacher walks. You can use this for your own walkthrough program if you already have one. It also includes tips for starting your own. If you're thinking, you know, I'd like to get some of this data. You can find that at kickup.co/lookfors. And then we also have two offerings from TeachFX. One is from David, and I think that's your email as well. So I'm going to go ahead and say that you'll probably respond to questions on that email too. But more tips about continuous improvement and using that research to lead school improvement. And if you're interested in TeachFX as well, there's also a TeachFX trial. And then the last thing I want to leave you with, and I hope that you're still on this call, because if you've been joining our webinar series in the past, we are really, really excited to announce an event in November. On November 17th, we're hosting a couple sessions, including a thought leader panel about the future of professional growth. And so we're going to be joined by people like Jen Abrams, Dr. Lavelle Brown from Ithaca, really to talk about what professional growth looks like as the dust is kind of settling around COVID. We've unlocked a lot of new potential for professional growth, and we really want to dig into what it looks like to make professional growth meaningful for educators. So you guys on this webinar are actually the very first people to be invited to this event. I hope that you feel special. And we're going to post the link in the chat as well if you would like to RSVP. We also will have some sessions led by district leaders that are just small roundtables where you can discuss how you're using things like continuous improvement to drive for professional growth in your own districts as well. So there will be lots of nice district connections too. Perfect. I think I have exhausted my very lengthy notes of housekeeping here. So I think that my last step really is just to thank David and Manuel for taking some time to join us today. And Manuel, thank you so much for being so vulnerable, sharing your story in ways that I think many people on this call will be excited to implement in their own districts as well. And then a last thank you to everyone who's on the call with us today. I know everybody has a webinar at basically every hour of the day that you could be joining, and we just really appreciate you taking this time with us. So like I said, these resources will hit your inbox today, as well as a recording, and we hope that we will see you on November 17th to join us for the K-12 Catalyst. Thanks again.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Great to be with you.
Bye.